No niin, täällä klubitilassa on juuri alkamassa Taideyliopiston Sibelius Akatemian tuottama Keynote-puheenvuoro. Adam Behr tulee meille alustamaan Keynote-puheenvuoroa ja hänelle kommentaattorina on English. No, nyt Adam. Joo, Adam English. Ja Andy. Nyt kaikki se Heikki Uimonen, Taideyliopiston Sibelius Akatemian professori, tulee kertomaan pienen alustuksen tähän alkuun.
No niin, tervetuloa minunkin puolestani, and welcome to the second keynote of today. And our speaker is Dr. Adam Behr, who received his PhD from the University of Stirling, written about history and group dynamics of the rock band, and is active in music industry research and policy research. He is a founding member of the Live Music Exchange, which operates out of Edinburgh and Glasgow universities with the aim of fostering dialogue between different stakeholders in live music sector. And his research has included investigations of Edinburgh's open mic scene and the place of popular music in Scotland's cultural policy. Recent projects include work on the cultural value of live music and the relationship musical practice and copyright. He also has a background as a bar manager, a guitarist and a bass player. And Adam will be commented later by Andy English, sitting over here. And Andy is an artist manager, tour manager and lecturer in the live music industry, and he would universally ban guest lists, encores and cover versions, which sounds very promising to me in terms of live music. But first, please welcome Adam Behr.
Thank you. The cultural value of live music, not a small topic. So to give a bit of background to it, I'd like to first of all just give the context of the title of this talk and why it's got such a large, seemingly large remit. And I'll give a bit of background to my own work and the work of my colleagues and how we came to cultural value of live music. And across this talk, in a way, what I'm dealing with as much is academic research into live music and the context and point of that, as much as the live music industry itself. The background to our work on live music is that historically, within popular music studies, within sociology, within economics as well, there was relatively little research on the live music sector, certainly compared to recorded music. And towards the end of the first decade of the 21st century, this started to shift. In terms of my own background, my colleagues Simon Frith and Martin Clunan won an award from the Arts and Humanities Research Council, the AHRC, to conduct research into live music in the UK, a history of all post-World War II live music in the UK, to reframe the history of UK music, to look at key actors like promoters and venues who had previously been marginalised. So this ran for 3 years. It was a 3-year funded project, resulting in a 3-book series, the first of which is out now. So I'm aware that this is an industry festival, so I'll give a little plug for the book as well. Following that, there was 1 year follow-on funding, it's called in Research Council parlance, to engage in what's called knowledge exchange, which is something of an academic buzzword now, and arguably what I'm doing here, which is to try and build bridges between academics and the people and sectors that they research. And out of this came the Live Music Exchange, which was like an online resource collating both industry research and academic research into live music. To provide a space, we ran a series of similar events to this to try and bring academics into the room with the industry they were researching. So that's where I came on board. The background to the actual research I'm talking about today, I'm sure you're well aware of a lot of that, was from an industry point of view, decline in recording revenues and inverted commas, boom in live music as artists, managers pivoted towards live music as a source of revenue. And we saw as recorded revenues declined, we saw increasing conglomeration in the live sector. But a lot of the research that showed this was produced by the industry itself. UK Music, so for example, Wish You Were Here, touted the value of live music and festivals to tourism within the UK, the economic contribution of the core music industry. This was all about making their case to government that music is something worth supporting. And of course, there was a growth in festivals and arenas. But who this boom was for, who it was serving, was less specifically addressed, because the background to all this was that pubs were closing, small venues were struggling. And of course, part of the political context of all this, just at around the time when live music was overtaking recorded music in terms of revenues, was the economic crash of 2008. And by live music, I'm not just talking about popular music here, I'm talking about all live music, so classical, jazz, in other words, state-subsidized music. And right around this time, there was huge pressure on arts funding, which continues to this day. So the background to the actual piece of research that we did last year was that the Arts and Humanities Research Council decided to address the ways in which arts were funded and the problems of arts funding. And so what they spoke to was, and these are all from the AHRC's call for proposals to research cultural value. Recent years have seen many attempts to capture that value in straightforward ways, not least in order to make the case to governments for public funding, but none have commanded widespread confidence. So part of the problem was that you had a lot of bodies like UK Music, in other words, stakeholders themselves saying, well, we're valuable. But none of the figures from these different bodies agreed. So government was skeptical about the value of such studies. And the AHRC sought to aggregate this and try and find a metric, a way of capturing cultural value to, again, they quote, establish a framework that will advance the way in which we talk about the value of cultural engagement and the methods by which we evaluate that value. I did warn you that this was an academic research body. Broaden our focus beyond publicly funded arts and culture to embrace all activities, including those in the third and commercial sectors. So, no small remit then. We're going to capture all ways in which culture is valued. Easy, no problem, we thought. So, our response to that was obviously guided by our own research background. And I should mention that the similar pressures that the arts were encountering were also encountered by academics, what's known as the impact agenda. In other words, we're no longer allowed, if we want to receive funding, to sit in our ivory towers engaging in blue sky research. It has to have a measurable impact on the ground. And one of the impacts that the Arts and Humanities Council Research Council hoped to gather from looking at cultural value was to lobby the Treasury, in effect, to shore up the subsidised, but not just the subsidised, arts. Now, obviously, our way into this was through an analysis of live music. And so late in 2013 and through 2014, we pitched two separate but related applications to this call for research. One was venue-specific and based in Edinburgh, and looked at different audiences and the ways in which they ascribed cultural value. And the second project was much more broad-ranging and looked at different types of UK venue, across the UK, and how they interacted with local and national policy. So I'll deal with these in turn. The overarching question, our first project dealt with the Queen's Hall, which is an Edinburgh venue, 900 capacity, partly state subsidised, it receives money from the local council. And why the Queen's Hall? Well, first of all, the questions that we're trying to get at was what is meant by cultural value in the context of live music? How could it be measured, if at all? What kind of value do the promoters, performers and audiences derive from participating in live music there? And this was the Research Council's criterion. How can new research methods for measuring non-economic value be applied to the case of live music? And from our perspective, how could qualitative research, i.e. how could we get beyond the numbers to people's accounts of themselves? How could qualitative research in the cultural experience of live music be used to complement existing research, the numbers, that seeks to build and develop audiences? So that was the first project. The second project was looking at the relationships between private and public investment at different levels within the UK's live music ecology. I'll say more about that in a moment. And how they differs. What were the strong points and the weak points within that whole matrix of economic activity? And also beyond that, what actually constitutes investment? The most obvious type of investment, of course, is financial investment. But there are other ways that governments, councils, and promoters can invest in live music, notably through legislation or regulation, or removing barriers to promoting live music. And how might policymakers usefully respond to these research findings to support the weaker parts of the ecology? So, I've talked about an ecological approach, and this sat in the background of all of our responses, all of our ways of thinking about live music. And the ecological approach basically depends on a view of interdependence across the sector, the interaction of musical and non-musical elements. So interdependence of different venues. So at the most obvious level, the stadiums and arenas at the top depend on those smaller and medium venues through which artists build their careers. They're training grounds. But crucially, they're not just training grounds. They're the sites of social interaction where new relationships are made, networks are formed, new types of music emerge, where tomorrow's arena fillers cut their teeth. So live music depends on networks, but is also embedded in that kind of material culture set around specific venues, the bricks and mortar. But the interaction of non-musical elements as well. So for instance, transport. Are there suitable buses to the venue? You can put on the greatest gig in the world, but if people can't get a late night bus back, they might not go. Regulation, licensing. How are noise complaints dealt with? Are the licensing laws so strict or so lax that it becomes difficult to put music on? So I'll go through now the first project. Why the Queen's Hall? Why did we pick this specific venue? Well, as I've said, partly because there was an intersection of public and private investment in it. Also, a huge variety of music. Everyone plays there. It's well known for folk and jazz music, but it's also home to the Scottish Chamber Orchestra, state-supported, and a variety of promotional practices. So the Queen's Hall is the site of three different, although overlapping, types of promoter. The state itself as a promoter, it's the home to the Scottish Chamber Orchestra, which receives direct government money. So indirectly, there's government money behind this orchestra that uses the Queen's Hall for the moment, it's moving soon, as its home. What we characterize as enthusiast promoters. And there's a huge spectrum of these, but basically the enthusiast promoter is anyone from a student putting on a gig for fun through to part-time promoters who maybe don't use live music as a way of paying their mortgage. No one wants to lose money on the gig. Amateurs, semi-professionals, and the Queen's Hall hires to them as well, right up to commercial promoters. Scotland and indeed the UK's biggest promoters, so Regular Music, one of Scotland's biggest promoters, DF, another one of Scotland's biggest promoters, all put on gigs there. So the sites of all these different types of promotional practice, small players, the state itself, and large commercial organisations all promote in the Queen's Hall. So, a bit of background, it was converted from a church in 1979, is owned by a charitable trust. As I've said, it receives some council support, about £100,000 per year, but relies heavily on commercial activity. So its income is 13% roughly public subsidy, this was in 2012, and that's from the council and also from cooperative productions with Creative Scotland. Creative Scotland is an arm's-length state funding body, the Arts Council for Scotland, basically. But over half of its income is from commercial hires to both big and small promoters. 22% from bar and catering, and 13%, it being a charitable organisation, from fundraising. And so what we did was we picked out case study concerts within the Queen's Hall to survey audience members about the ways in which they derived cultural value from what goes on there. So this was traditional music, Ali Bain and Phil Cunningham, accordion and fiddle duo. Folk, Heidi Talbot and friends. There's obviously some overlap between traditional and folk there. A jazz concert, the Scottish National Jazz Orchestra, playing at that gig with Branford Marsalis. Classical music, the state-funded Scottish Chamber Orchestra, and my favourite, the rock pop act, They Might Be Giants. So we used audience surveys. In terms of getting new methodologies, we also got audiences to fill out reflective diaries about their thoughts, where they interacted with the gig in the week leading up to it and the week after it. How often did they think about it? Did they go online? Did they discuss it with friends? All these things. Interviews with artists, promoters, and crucially venue staff and focus groups. And as per the call from the AHRC, our idea was to try and get to what they called intrinsic cultural value. So rather than instrumental value, the value that one derives from live music for things that it can do, the most obvious instrumental value is live music brings money into the economy. But there are other instrumental values as well, expressed in a load of ways. So, for instance, mental health benefits, urban regeneration, and I'll say more about that in a bit as well. But what the AHRC wanted to do was to see if it was possible to measure intrinsic value, the core value from which these instrumental values derive. Because there's a problem has been in terms of how the arts sector makes its case. What Warwick academic Eleonora Belfiore calls a defensive instrumentalism. What she means by defensive instrumentalism is that the arts sector has tended to rely on the language of instrumentalism, on impact indeed, saying that the arts will provide so and so many jobs, will lead to a reduction in spending on mental health interventions, will lead to a measurable amount of community cohesion, which has unhooked it from that intrinsic basis. So the language of cultural value has tended to be instrumental rather than intrinsic. But what we discovered, of course, is that the venue is an intrinsic part of the whole versus the venue is tied into the experiences of the gig goers, rather than the venue is just a functional aspect of that experience. And of course, different venues align with different career structures. So, pardon me. The Queen's Hall, for instance, has a certain amount of gravitas, converted church from 19th century building, different career structures. So for classical musicians in the state-supported sector, there isn't quite what we might call a toilet circuit, and I use the term advisedly because I think it does a disservice to many of the venues in that sphere. But the fact that that term toilet circuit has taken a hold does suggest that there are different perceptions of different musical worlds. We wouldn't talk about the toilet circuit for up-and-coming classical musicians because there's a whole different career strategy, career path than for popular musicians. And value judgments, like it or not, attached to those across state-subsidized and commercial sectors. Now, unsurprisingly, one of our findings, one of the first things that we found was that people find it incredibly difficult to ascribe intrinsic value. When pressed in interviews, musicians would either collapse into ephemeral terms. So, it nourishes my soul, it's good for the spirit, or they would then fall back into other types of instrumental language. It makes me feel better, it puts a smile on my face, it's good exercise, having a dance. So to actually get people to quantify and to get down through into intrinsic value was incredibly difficult. It was like trying to sort of split a cultural atom. You kept coming back to smaller and smaller subatomic particles of some sort of instrumental value. So what we tried to do was to shift from an idea of value as an innate good in itself to valuing as a process, to looking at how audience members and musicians, the language that they used to express their experiences of performing and seeing live music. So it's worth bearing in mind here that in the policy sphere, other fields have actually managed to leverage not so much the economic arguments as the language of economics, its valuation tools, to speak to mainstream policy. I suppose what I mean by mainstream policy is ultimately the Treasury. So to give examples, health and the environment have managed to make a case in kind of quantifiable terms more successfully than the arts, without collapsing into economic benefits. And this point made by David O'Brien in a report to the Department of Culture, Media and Sports, which says that the arts needs to present its case in a way that can be translated by number crunchers, even if the ultimate good being promoted isn't economic. So although intrinsic value is extremely hard to quantify, we don't necessarily need to restrict the language of quantification to economic criteria. And as I said, one way of trying to do this is to shift the emphasis towards the experience of participants, away from value as an abstract good contained to either a lesser or greater degree within live music. Now, in terms of how this played out across different audiences within the same venue, within the Queen's Hall, what we did notice were that there were cross-audience aspects, a set of what we called qualitative axes of experience that actually cut across all the different genres and all the different types of promotional practice, state-funded, commercial, and so forth. Now, I'm not suggesting that these are fully inclusive, and I'm not denying the possibility of overlaps, but they do point towards commonalities across genres, across musical worlds, from classical to rock, and crucially across state-subsidized and commercial musical experiences. So one of these, for instance, intimacy versus spectacle. The Queen's Hall was praised for the closeness that the audiences felt to the performer. Some audience members liked seeing musicians up close. Either they were musicians themselves, liked being able to see their fingers on the fretboard with minimal production. Others valued the idea of a show. Some were disappointed at the Queen's Hall, sort of relative lack of high-tech whiz-bang production values. But across classical, jazz, orchestra, and rock, there were different perceptions of what were valued, from intimacy, closeness to the audiences, to spectacle. Another aspect that came out through the Queen's Hall was the idea of atmosphere versus what I've called logistics. And I suppose what I mean by atmosphere is kind of unique characteristics of the venue. So the Queen's Hall was praised for its character, for the high roof, for the old imposing church buildings, but slated for the pillars that obscured the view of heart of the audience, and the church pews, which are uncomfortable. So the gravitas of the venue was a bonus compared to what was called a black box, purpose-built venue, purpose-built space. But perhaps it suffered in terms of some of the logistics. So we can compare the Queen's Hall to somewhere like the purpose-built Barbican. So more unique spaces that are fine for some segments of the audience. And the Queen's Hall sat in an interesting space here because the popular music, the rock gigs that are put on there, tend to attract the type of audience that still sees itself as going to gigs rather than concerts, but perhaps is less comfortable in a club space. So atmosphere versus logistics. And within the music itself, different survey respondents from across the board valued the idea of surprise and the unexpected versus a confirmation of taste that they already held. So repertoire would be one way of putting this. The idea of new songs versus classics, that old cliche of the well-established band saying, oh, here's one from our new album, as everyone makes a break for the bar. And the same sort of thing came up in the classical audience. There was a concert basically built around Bach repertoire, but with modern music in the same program as well. And a lot of respondents go, oh, why put that modern music in there? I didn't come here to hear that. So this idea of confirmation of hearing what you expected to hear versus hearing something new, something surprising, cuts across all those genres. And it's also worth pointing out that in terms of how people responded to that, didn't necessarily conform to sort of normative assumptions of what we might expect from different genre categories. So other ways in which audience expressed themselves were immersion in the music. Across the board, they all went for all noted that at its best, the live music experience was transcendent. But for many of them, all noted that the live music experience was transcendent, but pardon me. But this was expressed in different ways. So it might be rapt, quiet attention, or it might be clapping and singing along. And what we noticed in the focus group was actually a few members of the They Might Be Giants, one of them almost walked out because she was so put off by everyone else singing along. So these axes of experience don't translate neatly into what we might expect from genre. And it's also, the other point was that almost none of them noted as a key criterion value for money. Ticket cost obviously obviously was a factor in purchasing the ticket, but if the event had achieved that transcendent experience, then cost wasn't a factor. Likewise, if an event was disappointing, then cost wasn't a factor. Now, a few key differences across this. The main one being that for the pop audiences, for the rock audiences, we asked all audiences, which do you identify more with? The artist that is here now or the type of music that they're playing? And across the board, there were some differences. This is one of the main differences. So I'll quickly rattle through this. But for the artist being more important, for the Bain Cunningham gig, the traditional gig, artist more important, 27.5%. The folk gig, artist more important, 20%. The National Jazz Orchestra, artist more important, 21%. The Scottish Chamber Orchestra, 4.1%. And for They Might Be Giants, 61.5%. So the pop audiences identified much more strongly with the artist than with the genre. Just to give you a pictorial representation of that. So in terms of the Queen's Hall as a venue and its identity, it was a hybrid of state subsidy and commercial activity, but serves different constituencies. The state subsidised, both directly state subsidised in the Scottish Chamber Orchestra and arm's length, the Jazz Orchestra, different genres. But what we did notice was that all of the attendants there were music lovers, all identified music as a significant part of their life rather than fans of a particular act. So, and also in terms of a specific Queen's Hall demographic, people that the popular audience there, people that identify themselves as gig goers versus concert goers. So across the whole live music sector, still a perception of gigs, perhaps commercial, versus concerts. Something quite often more state subsidized. So the policy implications of all this: one, non-instrumental values placed on live music don't translate easily into policy. Two, policymakers need to resist the temptation to assess art in instrumental forms, but also to understand the nuances and the different ways that audiences reach that transcendent experiences. And three, if policy is ultimately about quality of life, then it needs to take account of qualitative accounts beyond market value. Now this takes us to our second project, which expanded the research to look at ecologies of investment. Our assumption being that the numbers are the tip of the iceberg in terms of the lived experience. So we took a qualitative snapshot via interviews with venues across the value chain, from small venues through medium-sized, mostly run by Live Nation, up to arenas in Camden, Glasgow and Leeds. Obviously there's no arena in Camden, but we spoke to the Roundhouse, the biggest venue there. And the PRS figures, we managed to get some outline PRS figures, but these only provided an outline of the activity. Our goal was to get interviews to flesh out the story, and you can see the full report online here. I'm going to outline some of our findings here. Firstly, that there are flaws in assumptions about what constitutes investment, and also in terms of long-established narratives of commerce versus community. So actually, even from commercial actors, there are all these hidden contributions, such as door staff being paid on to contribute to a Safe Streets initiative from a smaller venue, and this was a burden, staff having to stay on to help clean up the streets after the Camden Calling Festival. But we also noticed that commercial music benefits local character. So the owner of the Dublin Castle, the licensee of the Dublin Castle, spoke about the amount of tourists that would come in to sit in the same place that Amy Winehouse had drunk. Another perception that was revealed as problematic was the notion of market failure. There's a perception in funding the arts that market failure involves state support for those genres those types of music that find it difficult to support themselves commercially, such as jazz, such as classical, and so forth. But actually, looking around the country, what we noticed is that arena projects also constitute a type of market failure. The failure in the market here being right at the beginning. Of all the arena projects in Britain, pretty much only Newcastle, I think, was built without significant state investment. So the biggest shiny project recently, the SEC Hydro Arena, 40 million from state bodies, 15 million from Glasgow City Council, 25 million from Scottish Enterprise. Similar in Leeds. Now the benefits were framed in economic terms, and again these benefits came from the figures that the Scottish Exhibition and Conference Centre company that ran the arena themselves had provided, saying 4 billion in over 10 years. But it's less clear how that feeds back into local musical culture. So one of our findings then was that actually a lot of what local councils do in terms of funding the arts, in terms of supporting live music, tends to be based on two aspects. One is cultural provision, so educational outreach and so forth, and then big infrastructural projects. But a lot of the ways that they interpret particular laws that actually have nothing to do with music can have a very deleterious effect on the provision of live music. So, for instance, the Clean Neighbourhoods Act puts an extra burden on small promoters by charging a license for flyering. Noise abatement legislation can be interpreted particularly in a particularly draconian fashion. So the Glad Cafe in Glasgow, for instance, cited a labyrinth of problems with the local council. Difficult even to get them to come out to assess the noise when a gig was on. So police, health and safety, local policy, there's a tendency that we noticed as well for local councils to default to a position of live music as problematic. So the variations and nuances of local implementation are problems for the smaller and independent venues. It won't be a massive surprise then that the weakest point in the overall live music ecology is those smaller independent venues. So investment and support is widespread on paper from councils and from national governments, but focused on subsidised cultural provision, i.e. the high arts, and these big, what one of our respondents called the shiny projects. And these drive regeneration, perhaps, but actually it's these small venues that suffer at the hands of regeneration because people move in that are maybe slightly more well-heeled. The venue will start up, create jobs, help drive the property prices up in the neighbourhood, but then the incomers don't want this scruffy music venue there. So, and the councils tend to default to the noise complainant in terms of their sympathy. So these venues are often the first to fall and difficult to replace in terms of their social function that I've already mentioned. Those spaces where young musicians, where the next generation of arena acts meet each other, cut their teeth, hone their skills. So, for instance, in Leeds, the Duchess of York, a lauded music venue, now replaced by a Hugo Boss shop. Now that's regeneration, but it's debatable whether it actually adds to the cultural milieu of the area. So there's scope for better recognition of cultural provision by councils. And there's also a tendency to adopt a broad brush policy approach. And that's not necessarily appropriate even when it's well-meaning. So the famous example, of course, in Britain is the Live Music Act, which involved deregulation, but actually a couple of, in terms of you don't need a license for acoustic live music between certain hours of the day. But actually certain established music venues were saying, well, this is diluting the appeal, diluting our appeal in the area. So well-meaning, but not necessarily as effective as often lauded. Now, one of the things actually that the Live Music Act is a hopeful example of is that there's more dialogue now than there was 10, 20 years ago across the live music ecology. It's still dominated by the representatives of the bigger players in UK music, but there's more policy recognition of its importance. And more recently as well, another reason to be cheerful, a more coherent voice for the independent sector. So this is starting to leverage, this is another way in which investment need not be financial, starting to leverage existing legislation to preserve live music venues, so getting them registered as community assets, so to draw attention to their value, to enter the lobbying space. So I think Andy's going to talk about the Music Venue Alliance and Independent Venue Week to promote the fact that these small venues have the same type of cultural value as the state subsidised. So finally, it is hard to get local authorities to take note, but slowly that's happening. Thank you. Yeah. Just ask questions. I thought it was Q&A, so...
Okay. Yeah, we'll do Q&A. You keep the Q&A, I'll take one of the bubbles on I'll just shut up. It's working. Hello. Hi. So thanks Adam. One of my other reasons for being interested in this is I used to co-own a small venue in London, and I've was probably one of, if not the most vocal opponent of the Live Music Act, which is now law in England and Wales, but not Scotland and Northern Ireland, etc. And the notion was to, I don't want to just focus on one thing here, so kind of steer me along here, but the notion was to make it easier for people to put gigs on. That could be schools or churches, or if you're a church and you want to put music on more than two people, you have to get an entertainment license. And that would cost you money, it would cost you, filling a form out. I got a license and it wasn't that hard, but I understand why for some people it would have been. And when, as I mentioned, a body called UK Music, which is a lobbying group for the UK music industry, they represent the industry at a government level. This body and other UK bodies like Musicians Union, they sold this thing as a universally good thing. And no one seemed to be asking, well, if you're going to create, in their figures, the potential for 376,000 new gigs every year, where the fuck are the people going to come from? And it's not my point. My problem wasn't that figure was, it was a wild estimate. It was how should I say? It was figurative, and nobody ever questioned. How would that affect existing venues, which were now suffering in the worst economic crisis in human history, according to the Bank of England's governor? And they either didn't think about it, which is really fucking worrying, or they did think about it and didn't give a fuck. And nobody ever addressed it. Say, what about the current venues? So I was invited to City Hall in London with other small venue operators to talk to the mayor's team around about the Olympics, because they wanted to see what the city could do to help small venues. And they were saying, well, how can we help you with your marketing? And I was just standing there going, just give us some money. We've got no money. There's no state funding. There's no industry. We just haven't got any money. Give us some money. And I met one of the guys, a guy called Hamish Birchall, who was one of the guys who pushed this Live Music Act through Parliament, which is now law. And I said to him, Hamish, I've got a problem with the Act, and I want to ask you about it. And my concern is this. What about the venues that are already struggling that we have, the ones that, that a lot of the business would say are important to the industry all over England and Wales? And he said, so your argument's commercial then, you're not, you think, he he wrote it almost irrelevant, the fact that I was concerned about existing venues because they might suffer financially because we would dilute the audience. And he just dismissed it out of hand. So it's almost like he never thought about it or didn't care. And my problem wasn't that the fact that the act was a universally bad thing, but it was always painted as a universally good thing. There was never a conversation about it.
I think that's interesting. As I say, the responses to the act were different depending on where you are. And for the newer promoters, most of them thought, well, this makes life easier. It was for a couple of the smaller, and basically, if you're in the Academy Music Group or you're Live Nation, then you don't care. Who cares? You'll be fine. It was for the small, established venues that weren't connected to the Live Nation. I mean, a quick digression. Actually, one of the other points in terms of commerce versus community, and I think this feeds into why a lot of the independent venues are struggling, is that there's a perception of the likes of Live Nation and SJM that they own the sort of the big clubs and the Academy, but actually they own a lot of the very small venues that they can take a loss off, that aren't branded a Live Nation venue, a Mama Group venue. But if you're an independent operator in a pub and you've got down the road the Barfly, which sells itself as the sort of grotty Barfly, part of Camden history, but is actually part of a chain.
Yeah.
That's one problem. The other problem then is, of course, if all the other pubs around you start on a Sunday afternoon, suddenly doing free gigs. I asked the other architect of the Live Music Act, Lord Clement Jones,
Nice.
pretty much your question. Well, what about diluting the audience? And it was very much the market will take care of it.
Yeah. Well, that's capitalism, isn't it? So
Yeah.
that's the way it goes.
Now,
Sadly.
my sense about the Live Music Act is that it's neither a panacea nor a toxin, and that actually in the long run, but to address your question, no one had thought about these things. I think one of the reasons no one had thought about these things, and one of the things that actually I think is quite positive, if not in the act itself, then in the process leading up to it, is that you actually had the different stakeholders. UK music looked down from on its perch to pubs for more or less the first time. Now, we could go back and forth about whether the legislative response was the correct one, but I think the fact that UK music had sort of looked down and kind of addressed that, oh, hang on, how are we going to get arena fillers in 10 years' time if we don't take care of smaller venues?
Yeah.
Now, maybe their way of doing that is a sledgehammer to crack a nut. And I think that dialogue was useful, and I think it was also an important precursor to the Music Venues Alliance and the Music Venues Trust, who are now at the UK music table.
Yeah.
I wonder if you think that's a good thing or not. But
I think it's a great thing. It's a guy called Mark David who owns a small venue called the Tunbridge Wells Forum, one of the classic toilet venues. It actually was a toilet before it became a venue in England. And Mark's venue was threatened by a noise complaint, I believe, and he looked around and saw other venues in the same situation. So he did what I tried to do and failed a long time ago, which was get a bunch of venues in the room and a bunch of promoters in the room and say, how can we help each other? And I did it once in London, and then the second time, let's meet again. Nah, I'm not got time, man, I've got a show tonight, so we just didn't do it. But Mark done it. Mark got 120 venues from all over the UK in one room in London, and a bunch of people from the PRS and some big booking agents and some really quite high-profile players in a way that I could never do because my method is to get really angry and shout at people. And Mark understands that this needs a more political solution. And I don't mean political with a capital P necessarily, but anyway. So you got these people in the room, and I was there, and they debated it. I just sat and listened, because I've spent 8 years shouting my head off and sending out angry emails and writing angry blog posts about where's the money? when's the industry going to finally, when's Live Nation going to put 10 grand into a pot, and we'll use that to start a fund every year to fund small live venues, and finally create the first world-class small venue. We haven't got one, I don't think, small world-class venue in the whole of the UK. And every other European capital, every European city I know of has got one. You go to Prague, you've got world-class venues that are small because it's partly state funded. We've just got, it's called a toilet circuit because a lot of them are, metaphorically speaking, toilets. But anyway, so he's now got this group together called the Music Venue Alliance. Finally got a bit of a voice. Well, it's more than one voice, certainly, 120 of them. And it's not my place to tell anybody, these are Mark's plans, but there are some really interesting plans I've got in place right now to finally, possibly, please, create a world-class small venue circuit so when bands from Finland come, they don't think, when can we go home? Is there a backstage room? Can we get some clean towels? The basic things that you get in the Nordic region that are hard to come by. They're not entirely hard to come by in the UK. There are some wonderful small UK venues, but we really suck at customer service, and we suck at funding our venues to create good production. So hopefully the Music Venue Alliance will address that. And the trust is something else, though.
Yeah, the trust, I think the trust sort of speaks to the ways in which important parts of the music ecology actually have nothing to do with music. So what the trust is about leveraging part of the Localism Act of 2011, I believe, which our government, which at the same time is pulling money away, is saying we don't have any money for the arts, pulling money away from the arts. But to shore up its support in local communities, it said, well, there's this thing that you can do, which is you can register a building as an asset of community value. And their thinking is town halls and pretty buildings that were built in the 19th century that are now tea rooms, that if they go up for sale, and if they're on this register of community assets, then the community, a community group, there's a sort of moratorium put on the sale. They can't just sell it to the next developer that wants to do this. There has to be space given for the community to put, or interested party to put a bid in to buy this building. And what the Music Venue Trust is trying to do is to raise money. Now, the Act was there for pretty 19th century buildings, but what they're trying to do is to take this idea of cultural value of even a grotty toilet venue and say, actually, this is the building that Queen played in 1971, and Thin Lizzy played in 1975, and Amy Winehouse in 1990, whatever. This is an asset of community value. So that when, as happens all too often for financial reasons, it looks like it's going to go under and be bought by a property developer or whoever, there's a bit of space for the trust and for other interested parties to step in and try and keep it as a venue. Now, that's a piece of legislation that's got nothing to do with music, but actually, by a bit of creative leveraging, might save a few venues.
Yeah. I've got a very unpopular view on this, which Mark and I differ from. There's this notion of saving iconic venues and historic venues because of the history of them. And I have no nostalgia in me at all. I only care if a venue's good. I've never cared about who played there. So if we want to save small venues, that's great. But if they're shitholes and we won't improve them, I'm happy if Starbucks comes and builds a venue, a coffee shop, and pisses soy lattes on its grave. I just don't care. I spent my life waiting for, as we spoke backstage, independent operators to get their act together and finally create a small venue circuit we can be proud of. But we're such an incredibly arrogant nation. We used to be a very powerful nation politically and economically and in a military sense, and we just got this notion, but we are still extremely powerful culturally, and we know that, and we think, well, band, if I've treated like shit, that's fine, because there's 20 more bands coming in tomorrow from this, because they all want to come and play the UK. We're such a magnet for global bands in a lot of respects. And because we're that arrogant, we don't have to change. So if we do change and we do save some of these venues, we have to improve them. And that's when I'll get right behind this. But at the moment, I don't care the 12 Bar closed because Adele played. I only care if, when I went there, and it happened to me for years, if I was treated well, and so were the audience, and so was the artist. Otherwise, it was a 50-year-old venue or a 5-week-old venue, and the 5-week-old one's doing a better job with the customers, the audience, and the artists. I'll say the 5-week-old venue, and the place that Adele played in can become a Starbucks. But that's a very unromantic view.
I think
I've got yeah, we're good.
Okay, just one quick optimistic note,
Yes,
which is
please.
that if anything, what this has done, and hopefully will get those venues to raise their game. If you're going to get money from the government, if you're going to get that sort of attention, then you can't go on giving poor service.
Yeah.
And that sort of dialogue has actually meant that, I mean, admittedly he's standing down, but Mike Weatherly MP has actually just called on the Chancellor to give tax breaks to small rock venues.
Yeah.
So that sort of attention hopefully would get them to raise their game.
Yeah, let's hope so.